The Arab-Islamic Summit of 2025 will forever be remembered as a moment where the geopolitical stage trembled under the force of a single voice that cut through the carefully rehearsed speeches, veiled promises, and the labyrinth of diplomatic ambiguity. That voice was Ibrahim Traoré's, the young leader of Burkina Faso, who once again showed the world why his presence is increasingly regarded as a disruptive force against the traditional order. For decades, Africa had been treated as a spectator at global summits, often summoned to listen, but rarely invited to speak with conviction. Yet this time, the room fell into a deep silence as Traoré rose to speak, not merely as a representative of a small West African nation, but as the embodiment of a new movement of defiance, dignity, and uncompromising truth. The Qatar situation had already placed leaders in an uncomfortable bind. As the Gulf crisis unfolded, many countries were maneuvering cautiously, afraid to anger powerful neighbors, regional blocs, or the superpowers watching closely from afar. Discussions leading up to the summit were laced with hesitation, with words like diplomatic balance and strategic restraint dominating behind closed doors. But Traoré approached the stage without hesitation, his demeanor unshaken by the weight of history, and with every step he seemed to carry the voices of millions of Africans who have long yearned for leaders unafraid to speak plainly to global powers. From the very first words he spoke, there was no mistaking his tone. Traoré framed the Qatar issue not as a problem isolated to the Gulf, but as a reflection of the broader hypocrisy that continues to plague international politics. He drew sharp parallels between the treatment of Qatar and the decades-long manipulation Africa has endured at the hands of foreign powers, whether through the weaponization of sanctions, the exploitation of resources, or the pressure of international financial institutions. He reminded the summit that nations like Burkina Faso had lived for generations under externally imposed restrictions, dictated by powers who claimed to uphold justice while orchestrating inequity behind closed doors. The room, filled with seasoned statesmen and rulers, shifted uncomfortably as Traoré called out the double standards of those who sought to isolate Qatar while ignoring far greater injustices elsewhere. What stunned world! Leaders was not merely the content of his speech, but the fearless conviction with which he delivered it. Traoré spoke directly to monarchs, presidents, and prime ministers, reminding them that the Arab-Islamic world could not afford to fracture itself over disputes that ultimately benefit external powers more than regional unity. He argued that attempts to sideline Qatar mirrored the very tactics used to divide Africa, tactics that encouraged neighbors to turn on each other, weakening their collective power while foreign hands quietly took advantage. The young Burkinabe leader's words carried an authenticity few could deny, for he spoke not from a position of entrenched privilege, but from lived experience of resistance and struggle against the old colonial frameworks that still haunt Africa. As the cameras focused on his face, viewers across the globe could see that this was not a leader engaging in polite diplomacy. His language was measured but sharp, fiery but composed, and above all, unapologetically honest. He declared that the persecution of one nation in the Arab-Islamic world is, by extension, the weakening of all nations in the global South, because the same blueprint used against Qatar has long been applied against Africa. His words painted a picture of interconnected struggles, whether the blockade of Qatar, the strangling of African economies through debt, or the military interventions justified under the guise of peace. In each case, the victims were nations striving for independence, while the beneficiaries were the entrenched powers seeking to maintain global dominance. Traoré's speech gained further weight as he turned his attention toward the broader question of solidarity between Africa and the Arab-Islamic world. He reminded the audience that both regions share centuries of intertwined history, culture, and faith, as well as a shared legacy of colonial disruption. Instead of allowing old powers to dictate the terms of their unity, he called for a renaissance of cooperation rooted in sovereignty, mutual respect, and economic independence. He pointed to Qatar's resilience in the face of blockade as proof that smaller nations could defy even the strongest of coalitions if they remained steadfast and invested in themselves. Likewise, he argued, Africa too must learn from this lesson to stop depending on external validation and instead cultivate self-reliance. The boldest moment came when Traoré issued a challenge to the summit. He questioned why so many leaders gathered in that room were hesitant to openly defend Qatar against unfair isolation. Was it fear of economic retaliation from larger powers? Was it the temptation of short-term alliances with Western patrons? Or was it, as he implied, the erosion of courage among leadership that had grown too accustomed to the comforts of status quo politics? The rhetorical questions were pointed, and though no one answered, the unease was palpable. Several leaders avoided eye contact, while others whispered to aides, uncertain of how to respond. But the fact that no one interrupted him was itself a testament to the impact of his words. What made this speech resonate beyond the walls of the summit was the symbolism of who delivered it. Traoré, leading one of the poorest nations in the world, stood before kings and presidents whose countries possess vast wealth, and yet he spoke with a strength that transcended material power. His authority derived not from gold, oil, or military dominance, but from an authenticity and clarity that exposed the contradictions of global diplomacy. In that moment, the world saw a reversal of roles. The so-called weaker voice became the most commanding in the room, and the powerful were left to grapple with their own silence. International media outlets were quick to broadcast snippets of Traoré's address. Some Western commentators criticized his tone as reckless, calling it inflammatory and divisive. Yet in many parts of Africa, the Arab world, and among communities that have long felt sidelined by the global order, his speech was celebrated as historic. On social media, clips of his fiery delivery went viral, with hashtags calling him the Lion of the Sahel and praising his refusal to bow to pressure. Analysts noted that his intervention could reshape alliances, embolden smaller nations to speak more boldly, and even push the Arab-Islamic bloc toward greater independence from Western influence. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Traoré's speech was its ability to connect past, present, and future into one sweeping narrative. He invoked history, reminding the summit of how colonial powers once pitted tribes and nations against each other to maintain control. He linked it to the present, pointing out how the divide and rule strategy still manifests in sanctions, blockades, and manipulative diplomacy. And he painted a vision of the future in which Africa and the Arab-Islamic world break free from the shackles of dependency and chart their own course together. It was not just a critique of injustice, it was a call to action. By the time Traoré concluded, the silence in the hall was more powerful than any applause. Leaders sat stunned, some nodding reluctantly in agreement, others uneasy but unable to refute the truth he laid bare. The fiery speech became the defining moment of the summit, overshadowing the carefully crafted communiques and polite declarations that would follow. For the world outside, it was another reminder that Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed as a transitional figure, had cemented his role as one of the most influential and fearless voices of a new global order. The Qatar situation may have been the official topic of discussion, but after Traoré's intervention, it became clear that the real issue was much larger. It was about whether nations long pushed to the margins would continue to accept their place in the hierarchy of global power, or whether they would seize moments like this to demand equality, justice, and self-determination. And in that regard, Traoré's fiery words did more than stun world leaders. They ignited a conversation that will reverberate for years to come, both in Africa and far beyond.